Hello, everybody, and welcome to a new episode of When Life Happens. My name is Simone Boersma, and this is the podcast about mental growth. Today, I will speak with Dr. Richard Schwartz. He is the founder of the method of internal family systems, IFS. We speak about what it includes and how it evolved over the years. We speak about the parts, the self, and about the 8 Cs. I really appreciated that he took the time to speak with me and to inspire you all. Thank you, Dr. Richard Schwartz. Welcome, Dr. Schwartz, Richard Schwartz from the US. Thank you so much for participating. You are founder of the methodology of the IFS, Internal Family Systems. And I think we can start with that. The first question to you. Can you tell us what the internal family system model is?
Yeah, I'll try to make it brief, but thanks for your interest, Simone. I, it is well, it started as a way of doing psychotherapy, but it's become also a kind of life practice and for some people, a kind of spiritual practice. Yeah.
And what I see if I read about it and I see your conferences and your talks online, I also recognize a lot of Freudian aspects in it. Is that correct, or do I see that wrong?
I would say yes and no. There are certainly, I mean, we're exploring the same territory he did.
Mhm.
Uh, but he had a different view of some of the characters within this territory. So, um, yeah, so, and he never explicitly talked about what I call parts, as far as I know. It was more impulses and drives and thoughts.
Yeah.
So, but, there are certainly elements of this sort of syndromes that he discerned that are similar.
Yeah, especially because then I just zoom in about the IFS method. Um,
Hmm.
the the core actually are the parts, the self, and the 9 Cs. If I'm correctly,
8 Cs, yeah.
8 Cs. Sorry, 8 Cs.
Okay.
Um, and especially if you talk about the self, that's where I see a lot of Freudian aspects in it.
Huh.
Um, but let's start with the parts, because for the people who are watching and seeing this, can you tell us what you mean with the parts?
Yeah. Um, so almost 40 years ago, I had some clients who started talking this language of parts, and they would say things like, when something bad happens in my life, it triggers this critic inside who starts calling me names, and that brings up another part of me that feels worthless and empty and alone. And then to get away from that comes in the binging part, who makes me binge on food. And then that brings the critic back, who's calling me a pig now.
Mm-hmm.
And that makes me feel worthless again. And so I need the binge again. And as I listened to that, I'm trained as a family therapist, so it sounded interesting. It sounded like these little interacting patterns that I'd been studying in families. And I got very curious and at first got scared because it sounded like they were talking about multiple personality disorder. Like
Mm-hmm.
they were talking about these things as if they had a lot of autonomy and knew how to interact in ways that they couldn't control. And then I started listening inside myself, and oh my God, I've got them too. And so then I just got very curious and have concluded now, after all this time, that it's the nature of the mind, it's the healthy mind, to have these parts, to have sub personalities, that everybody has them, and that it's very good to have them because they all contain valuable resources and talents to help us in our life. But that trauma and what we call attachment injuries, which is bad parenting basically, forces them out of their naturally valuable states into roles that can be destructive, but were maybe necessary when you were young, because many of these parts get frozen in time during the trauma and think you're still 5 years old and think they still have to protect you in the way they did then. So yeah, so there aren't any bad parts. They're all valuable, but they get forced into these extreme roles and they carry what we call burdens, which are the extreme beliefs and emotions you took on during the trauma that attach to these parts and drive them almost like a virus, like the coronavirus. So that's a bit of a different view of these drives that Freud discovered, and it lends itself to a very compassionate way of working with yourself inside and with therapists working with their clients.
And what's the actual difference between working at it as a cognitive trauma therapist and working with the IFS method? What's really the critical difference?
Well, let's give some examples. So let's say I'm working with you and you have a panic attack in my office.
Mm-hmm.
A typical trauma therapist would say, take some deep breaths, feel your feet on the floor, would try to pull you away from that panic and do what they call ground you, using these grounding skills. Does that sound right?
It sounds right. Yeah, there are some
Okay.
notes, some hooks on it, but but continue.
Yeah. And I instead would be saying, oh, it's so great. There's that little scared part that's here now. And we get it's really, really scared, but we want to help it. So, Simone, I'd like you to let it know it's welcome to be here. And we want to and see if you can get curious about why it's so scared. So it's a very different way of understanding panic attack, for example.
So what you're actually saying is that you awaken curiosity.
Yeah, I help people.
Curiosity instead of blocking the fear.
That's exactly right. Yeah, that's in a nutshell.
Okay, so then we have to first see actually there.
Exactly.
um, um, if you look back and go a little step forward, I think we are in an occupation where it's more than important to reflect on ourselves, our practice, our way of working, thinking, acting. We work with human beings, with their mental health. If you sit in the chair in the evening now, after all these years, and you need to be critical on yourself and on the methods of EFS, what would you change or where would you be critical on?
Huh. Uh, I I'm afraid I can't think of anything. I mean, I feel really good about it. I feel like it's evolved. It has changed. It's changed a great deal in the last 40 years, but uh, and it continues to. But um, I can't think of anything in particular that I would have changed at the moment. I've not been asked that question in a long time, so I feel good about it.
Well, it's good. That's good. You speak about, okay, it is involved in the years.
Mhm.
What are the most changes or involvements?
You know, we mentioned the first C word, curiosity, but
Mhm.
the the biggest, I think, the biggest contribution of IFS is this discovery that while there are all these parts and they're burdens and they make us do things we don't want to do, just beneath them is what I call the self with a capital S. That's a very healthy, undamaged essence inside everybody. And when the parts trust it's safe to let it out, that self can just knows how to heal. It knows how to heal you and your parts inside. It knows how to heal relationships in the outside world. And and why we mentioned the first of the 8 C's is because as I was helping people access that, simply by getting these parts to open space inside, it was like the same person would pop out and would have the same qualities. And I cataloged those qualities across people, and it turned out they were all began with the letter C. So we have calm, compassion, uh, curiosity, confidence, courage, creativity, clarity, and connectedness.
Mm-hmm.
And so that person who carries all of that is one of the goals is to help the parts trust that they don't have to run things and they can let this person run both their inner lives and their outside lives. And I can't remember how I got onto this, what your original question was.
Um, I asked you what the difference was.
Oh, yeah, yeah. So early, in the earlier days, I didn't know how much I could trust the self. Like, I was still in the mode of a therapist who would give the client answers or try to give them interpretations or information that I assumed they didn't have. And so I would access some self and have the client talk to the part, but then I would feed lines to the client to say to the part. And then gradually I decided, maybe self can do a lot of this. I don't have to work so hard. And so instead I started to say, what would you say, Simone, to this part? And the person would say exactly the right answer. And it's often things I wouldn't even have thought to say to the part. And so it took quite a while, I'd say, to fully trust self-leadership. But yeah, that would be the thing that's evolved the most is, and it makes for a very collaborative relationship between the therapist and client, where I'm not the big expert giving you the answers. I'm a kind of guide who's helping you access them inside.
I think that's the core of a good therapist and a good pedagogue. I remember when I was in college that we really were learned how to ask open questions and to guide a person instead of giving them advice.
Hmm.
That's the basic of being a good therapist,
Uh-huh.
to activate the human mind
Hmm.
and to make sure that there is a change.
Hmm.
How do you make sure that you have the connection with the patient within this method?
Yeah, so that's another thing I think that IFS contributes, which is a very concrete way to notice when I, as a therapist, am in those 8C qualities, when I'm embodying self energy and when I'm not, when there are parts of me that are triggered and are lurking around. And so before I go to work with somebody or before I do an interview like this, I'll just notice there's 4 or 5 what we call markers that I can notice if I am in before I start something like this. And so how open is my heart? Or do I have a big agenda here? Or am I feeling nervous about this? Or anything like that. I'll just go and find the part that's giving me those feelings. And I'll just remind it that I can handle this, that they can relax and let me do the interview and they can they can hang around if they want, but they don't have to take over and make me feel all that.
To
And
say
then
that
I'll
that's a
suddenly,
little bit of the somatic experience you described right now.
what's that?
Can we compare that to somatic experience, what you described right now? Or do you see it in a different light, different view?
Are you talking about somatic experiencing?
Yeah.
Well, they don't really work with parts in somatic experiencing, as far
No,
as I know.
no, they don't. But it sounds a little bit like with you describing the feelings you have, noticing what is going inside your
Yeah,
body.
well, IFS is a very somatic approach.
Yeah.
It's not somatic experiencing, but parts have a big impact on your body. So we're we're noticing what we call trailheads, which are if you focus on this emotion and get curious about it and ask it questions, it'll take you to the part that's giving you that emotion. And then you can start a dialogue with that part. So, yeah, SE doesn't have a monopoly on somatic uh, feelings. I mean, it's our way of helping us find parts.
Yeah.
One way. There's
Yeah.
several others.
And did you also, if we go back to the part where you mentioned trauma in the beginning, did you also make research with your method on generational trauma?
I'm not sure what you mean by research, but yes, what we call legacy burdens
Mm-hmm.
is a big part of IFS. And that's sort of the cutting edge, I would say now, is helping people unload these legacy burdens they got from sometimes, you know, decades or centuries ago in their family heritage. And I'm very interested in doing that collectively more and more. So we're starting groups here to help white people unload the racism that they carry, the legacy burden of
Mm-hmm.
racism. But anyway, there's a big interest in that.
Can you zoom in a little bit more about that? You mentioned, okay, to let go of the racism that it's there for decades right now. Can you zoom in a little bit more and tell us more about that? More about the how you do it?
Yeah, well, if I were working with you and you were part of a group and we were all doing this, I would have you focus on the parts of you that say racist things in response to certain stimuli, and have you find them in your body and notice how you feel toward them. And you probably feel very ashamed of them or hate them or something like that. And I would help you get those parts to open up a little space so you can get to know the parts that carry the racism, and do that until you could be curious about it. And then you would ask some questions about that, and you would ask these parts where they got these beliefs in the past. And if it's a legacy burden, they would just say, I got it from my family, or I got it, and then there's a way to ask them if they like having to carry it. And most of the time they don't. And so we just send it out of your system.
Yeah. So it's a mixture of, and I'm going back to the terminologies, a mixture of psychotherapy with knowing yourself.
Yeah, well, psychotherapy is about knowing yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
From my
exactly.
point of view.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's beautiful. And if you look forward now, you say, okay, now I'm really happy with how things are going. Do you have goals for the future?
For IFS, or
Yeah,
yeah.
for IFS. Yeah.
Yeah, we just this weekend had our annual conference,
Mm-hmm.
and there were presentations that were very exciting to me, because the first day was all what we come to call BIPOC people, all black people or indigenous people,
Mm-hmm.
uh, there were 20 workshops on IFS uh, and microaggressions, IFS, and racism, and so on and so on. And so that's a big interest now, is how can this be applied to that arena? And also, how can we change as an institute so that we can be more welcoming to diverse people and marginalized people? And so that's one thread. And then, uh, for example, there was a presentation by a group of indigenous people, and there's a IFS uh, tribal elder kind of group I didn't even know about much,
Mm-hmm.
that are bringing it to indigenous people. And another plenary the next day was on bringing it to the Middle East. And so there were leaders from Jordan and Egypt and Lebanon who were all not only bringing it as therapy, but also they have schools now that are based on helping kids learn this, and camps where teenage kids go off and work with their parts. So more and more, my vision is to have this not only help clients, but also become part of the culture because it has the potential to really make for a cultural change.
So that's your
And
aim, your vision, your goal.
yeah, now I'm getting old, so I want to see more of that manifest.
Yeah. Are you pleased with what you're accomplished now?
Yes, I mean, in some ways have far exceeded the ambitions that I had originally, but I also see the need and the, how far it could go. So,
What's the need?
well, the world is really a mess.
Hmm.
There are legacy burdens that are driving all kinds of conflicts all over the world, and that in this country, there's so many what we call exiled people
Hmm.
and so much pain. And so the protectors in this country are very extreme and polarized with each other and creating all kinds of havoc. And there's all kinds of denial about climate change. And all of those things could be affected if we could just bring more what I call self to these issues and bring more to the planet. So that's the big vision.
Do you think that you need a different approach in different parts of the world with IFS?
Um, you mean, does IFS itself have to change? That hasn't been the case. We now have outposts in Russia and in Korea, and uh, I could go on, just all over the world.
But do you
In the
see
United
that you need to have another approach as a
I'm
it,
saying no, that hasn't been the case. No.
okay. Okay.
Even in very collectivist cultures where there's a sort of anti-individualism bias, um, because one of the C words of self is connection,
Hmm.
people can embrace it, and they do. It's
So
quite
the
popular all over
cultural
the place.
differences are no boundaries.
Say it again?
The cultural differences, there are no boundaries in it.
I'm not sure what you mean. There are no
If you
boundaries in the
have
culture.
if the cultural differences there are across the globe. So when you have, for example, a girl who is from Indonesia and has a trauma, sexual abuse trauma, and you have a girl from the Netherlands who is sexual abused.
Huh?
They live in a different context, in a different world, in a different country with different beliefs, ideas, ideology, religion, etc.,
Huh?
etc.
Yeah.
Where if I see it, they need some different approach to make the connection to awaken curiosity. Is that also something you recognize, or do you not see that within the IFS approach?
Again, that hasn't been our experience. My experience is more that, and I've done interviews with people from all over the world.
Mhm.
If I can be in this place of self, because I'm not the funnel for their wisdom, I'm not the one trying to tell them how to heal or what they need to do. If I can be in this place of self and have help them start to find their parts, it really doesn't matter what culture they come from,
Yeah.
because they then, when they access their self, begin to relate to their parts in a way that's culturally syntonic. That's part of the beauty of it being such a collaborative process. I'm not sure if you're following what I'm saying,
Yeah,
but
I'm following what you're saying. Yeah. Okay. And if we go back
I'm
then,
not, and I'm also not saying that there are ways that therapists need to be sensitive to cultural differences or to things that could be hurtful to people of different cultures. That's a lot of what we're working on now, particularly with BIPAC people. But in terms of the model itself, when you start to do it, you could there are like if I'm working with a black person, I might ask initially, are there parts of you that are reluctant to be vulnerable with me because I'm white? and
Mm-hmm.
we would have that conversation. But aside from that, I think it's pretty universal.
Yeah. So the most important thing is that trauma sensitive approach.
I guess so.
Yeah.
Call it that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. If you would stand now again before another crowd of people or another audience to tell about IFS, about the existence, about the method itself, about the development, if you should choose one part in a 5-minute talk, what would you choose to really, what really is the most important, essential thing in it?
Uh, in 5 minutes, I can usually convey that parts aren't what they seem, that it's a
Mm-hmm.
big mistake to battle with them and to try and get rid of them, or to try to ignore them, which so many people try to do to try to bypass them.
Mm-hmm.
They're actually valuable and hurting. They're like inner beings that need your love. And then that, in addition, there is this self in there that can be accessed. You don't have to meditate 20 years to get to it. It's just beneath the surface of these parts. And by asking them to open space, it emerges spontaneously and knows how to heal these parts. So those are the two big ones that I would try to convey.
That was very clear, and I think it's, yeah, and it's a beautiful, beautiful way of approaching it. Is it difficult to reach that self for people?
Not at all. I mean, for people who have what's called complex trauma, complex
Mm-hmm.
PTSD,
Complex trauma, yeah.
there's their protectors are very frightened about dropping their guards, and for the self to emerge, the protectors have to open space for it. So in the beginning, a lot of the work is helping the protectors trust that it's safe to do that. But once they do, it's immediate. They open space and self emerges spontaneously.
Okay. It sounds almost too easy
Uh-huh. Yeah, I've
if
heard that before.
if you say it like that. If
Uh-huh.
you think that in a neurological way, which
Hmm.
we can talk about for hours, it sounds
Right.
almost too easy to reach
You
that.
know, at our conference, I had a debate discussion with Bessel van der Kolk about this very issue. You
Really?
know who he is? Yeah,
Yeah, of course I know him. You know, he's an original Dutch, so I know
I
him.
know. I know.
Yeah,
He's
I
got those, he's got all those burdens, right?
know. No, of course. I think everybody in the field of trauma knows him.
So, and we had a discussion about that very issue of whether the brain is, whether the brain determines how much you can access or change, or whether the self can emerge that quickly.
And
And he,
how did take us in that discussion? So what were the arguments from both sides?
well, he's very attached to the brain, so he thinks
Mm-hmm.
if you if you didn't get certain kinds of parenting or loving when you were a child, you don't have that in your brain. You don't have that template. And so he's very skeptical about what I'm calling self and how quickly you can get to a point where you know how to do this for your parents, because he's very attached to that brain paradigm, and if and from and also to an attachment based paradigm that says to get any of that, you had to have had those certain kinds of parenting experiences, and you need to get that from the therapist. You need, he's very into touch, and that the therapist needs to touch in a way that the client never had before, because you need to have that visceral experience in your life, and it's just a different paradigm, because self can do all of that, and
So
it's
what was
hard
your
for
answer to that? If you got
I
that
would
argument, what do you say about that?
I'd say this is a different paradigm. And I can't convince you because you're very attached to these two paradigms. But I, I and the 2,000 people watching have all had the experience of helping people very quickly access self and self, even people who had never had any kind of good parenting in their lives, in their childhoods, have that same self. And that self knows how to do this. That you don't have to have a therapist who gives you the corrective experience. It's just it's just a different paradigm. So the argument can't go that far, really.
No. So it's just another point of view as well.
Well, I have plenty of evidence. It's not just a point of view. I'm an empiricist.
Yeah.
My training is a scientist, so I have plenty of evidence. It's just that when you're very attached to these paradigms,
Hmm.
they limit what you're willing to look at in terms of evidence.
No, I meant from both sides,
Uh-huh.
that you see it from different points of view, from different kind of evidence based. So it's very interesting, I think, always to have those discussions or those dialogues between colleagues. I think
Mhm.
that keeps us sharp.
Well, we're also very good friends, so it was warm and fun.
Yeah, but that's I think that's a beautiful thing, and I think it's a thing we sometimes not always cherish.
Hmm.
The
Right,
wisdom of colleagues as well.
right.
That there are a lot of people who, uh, and I'm not saying now I don't want to mark people or whatever, but there are people who just say, okay, I learned, I studied for it, so I know it all, and then
Hmm.
are not open for feedback or any kind of dialogue or growth or whatever new ideas. And I
Right,
think
right.
that's a pity, because even after you got that paper, I think then your learning process starts.
Hmm.
And having now these dialogues from my perspective, now talking to you, talking to other people, I've learned so much over the last month,
Hmm.
only by seeing it from a different point of view,
Hmm. Yeah.
or having new methods
Hmm.
or experiences.
That's
So
right.
it's beautiful that you have that and that you have that connection.
Thank you.
Yeah. Is there anything at the moment for the people who are listening, watching, you would like to say, or you want to contribute to them to say, okay, this is my message to you?
Um, I don't think more than I have, just to know that this is a different paradigm. It is a different way that if they want to try just focusing on their own inner critic for a second and getting curious instead of fighting with it or running from it and ask why it's doing this inside, they'll get answers about how it's trying to protect them. And they can form a new relationship with that part of them. I'm just using the critic as an example, but um, this is something very practical. I do in a longer talk, I would have everybody go inside and do a piece of work with a part, and the people are amazed. So uh, just that's the message is give it a try.
Thank you very much for
Thank you.
participating, for wanting to share your ideology, your method of IVS, and to share the knowledge you have.
You're
Thank you.
very welcome.
Thank you.
Glad to do it.